All right, so let's talk a little bit about agenda. So this is meant to be a kind of 200-level technical talk. We'll talk a little bit about some AWS best practice, both compliance side and security side, some preventative controls you can put in place, as well as Shaker's going to talk a little bit about some of the ways that they extend what's built into the platform. So that'll be kind of the overview. So we'll start with the shared responsibility model. Hopefully this is not the first time you've seen this slide. I'm guessing this might be the 9th or 10th time you've seen this slide this week, but there's a reason we show it with every single talk. It's really important. It's the most important thing you can understand about security is how this works. If anybody hasn't seen this, I'll spend a couple minutes on it. The idea of the shared security model with AWS is the idea of, the way we put it is, security of the cloud, right, which is our responsibility, and security in the cloud, which is your responsibility. A note that I'll make about this slide before I kind of explain what those responsibilities might look like is that line, that kind of point of demarcation, moves up and down depending on the service we're talking about. The slide that's on the screen right now that you're looking at is really focused around infrastructure as a service services, right? You see kind of the reference to responsibilities on the top half of the slide, like operating system, network, firewall configuration. If we're talking about EC2, those are your responsibilities, right? We take care of the hypervisor down, we take care of the physical facility and all those things. On top of that, you're responsible for securing your operating system, patching your operating system, et cetera. But as we talk about higher level services, right, more managed services, we sometimes call them, oh, itchy trigger finger there, AWS takes on more of that responsibility. We take care of more of it, and you focus more on your data, your application, et cetera. So just keep in mind as we talk about this and as you explore and use different services that this line moves depending on the service, and we've got documentation for each service that can kind of explain where your responsibilities lie and where ours stop. So we'll talk about security of the cloud a little bit, right? What are some of those things that we're doing below that line to secure these environments? And I'll start on the slide with saying that right, Amazon has deep experience running large data centers. We've been doing it for a long time. So some of our responsibilities are things that are more obvious, like climate management and fire suppression in the data centers, but those are things that as a customer you don't have to worry about. We just take care of that for you, right? No longer your responsibility. Something that we sometimes skip over because everybody kind of thinks, oh yeah, no, data centers, and we talk about kind of data center facilities and infrastructure things, is also the software and automation, right? Our platform is highly automated. That's how we as AWS scale. Humans are difficult to train, right? And they make mistakes, and they're hard to scale. So the way to scale things is to automate as much as possible, to do things repeatably over big scale the same way every time. So, man, I gotta put this thing down, sorry. So a big part of our responsibility for securing the cloud is also the software we develop and operate to maintain and provide that level of automation that you see as the console or the APIs that let you stand up instances, that let you start databases on short notice, those sorts of things. Other things we do, like our physical security of the facilities, right, and maintaining that, two-factor authentication, right, guards, a lot of details on, we launched a website actually where you can take a virtual data center tour now and see what one of our facilities looks like. And I think one other fun thing, that picture on the left gets used a lot. I think solution architects really like sharing this one, but to give you an idea of some of the controls we put in place to secure our facilities, we'll talk about media sanitation, sanitization, right? The idea of what happens with a hard drive when we're done with it at AWS, what happens when a hard drive, when it fails, and that's a hard drive in that person's hand there, right? We wipe them and we physically destroy them. Media doesn't leave our data centers. Portable media isn't allowed within the system boundary in our data centers. It is a consistent control. It is an easy to understand control that we can implement at all of our facilities globally. And that is our approach to our side of security, is consistent controls that we can implement everywhere to make sure that they're implemented correctly and followed consistently. So enough about what we do. Hopefully you guys came here to find out what you can do, right? So let's talk about security in the cloud. So there's lots of good pieces of guidance you can follow. I recommend, and there will be some of these on a resources slide towards the end of the deck, but I recommend looking at the security pillar for the well-architected framework. I recommend the Cloud Adoption Framework has a security perspective. We're going to use that as kind of a guideline. We won't talk about what's in the CAF heavily. We'll just use it as kind of a guiding way to organize thoughts here today. There is security best practices white papers. There's a couple good encryption white papers if you need to dive deep on that. I'd recommend if you're trying to get started and make sure you're covering down on the biggest best practices, aside from the ones I'm going to talk about today, that the well-architected framework security pillar is a great way to get started. That is really just a document that lists out what we see as top security best practices in the cloud that you can follow. And some of those are what we'll be talking through today. A little bit of a note about the cloud adoption framework and what we're going to talk about here. The security perspective breaks the controls down into 4 kind of categories. And if you're not familiar with that language, that idea of a control is something that you put in place to mitigate a threat or a vulnerability, right? So a control might be something like, oh, I'm going to patch my operating systems. I'm going to configure a firewall. But it can also be, and actually we'll just talk through them, right? So directive controls, the idea of those, and we won't spend a lot of time on that today, is really, from our perspective, the governance model, right? There are things like having the system security plans. There are things like having incident response plans. There are things like having guidance on how things are to be configured. So it's much more a management and governance level activity. We're going to focus a little bit more on the technical here. We're at a public sector conference. I assume most people in the room already have those sorts of things mandated on them, right? You're working through RMF or other similar processes that provide you that governance layer. So where I'll leave it is make sure that as you're thinking about that governance layer that's probably already required of you, that you're thinking about specializing it for the cloud environment you're in and making sure it's adapted to take this environment into account. Like, for example, the way you might do incident response on the cloud is probably going to be different than how you would have done it traditionally. So dig into those things and make sure you explore those corners. The other 3 areas where we're really going to focus, preventative is the idea of things you're going to put in place beforehand to try to prevent there being any issues, right? Detective are controls you're going to put in place to understand if you've got a deviation from the approved configuration, right? Whether that is somebody made a mistake and misconfigured something, or whether there's been some sort of compromise that you now need to react to, right? When we're talking about security, we're always planning for compromise. Responsive controls are the ones that define how you're then going to bring things back into spec. How are you going to find and correct that misconfiguration? How are you going to respond to that incident? So we'll talk first about preventative controls, and we'll spend most of my chunk of the time here focused on these. So I've got kind of 3 critical ones up here on the slide, but the first thing we'll talk about is identity and access management, both the concept and the AWS service, right? So in AWS, the identity and access management service is your service to control the identities and authentication credentials of everybody that signs in. This is where you create users to use the platform. This is where you create credentials for those users. This is where you define policy that says what those users can do. Like, for example, my administrators can create new S3 buckets, or my administrators can't create new S3 buckets, right? These system operators have access to this set of logs and only this set of logs. They can't start new systems. Whatever's appropriate for your environment, you can do fine-grained access control in this service. And it's essentially mandatory, right? The only user you get when you start a new account is root. So the first thing you should do is looking at some of these best practices with a new account is one, multi-factor authentication for privileged users, especially root. Like our best practice guidance is you take that root account, you put an MFA device on it, and you put it away in a safe and you forget you have it. And you never use root again unless you have to. It's a break glass in case of emergency account with multi-factor authentication that you immediately stop using. But additionally, like your administrators and other privileged accounts, right? Credentials, secrets for authentication are notoriously hard to handle, right? How much time do we spend working with users on picking secure passwords and not writing them down? Like it's one of the hard parts of this. So anything you can do to provide an extra layer of protection around those credentials is a good idea, especially around privileged accounts, and that's where this MFA recommendation comes in. In that theme, right, of managing credentials is IAM roles, and I'll talk about this in 2 places. One is, we'll talk about actually groups and roles. Groups first, right? A lot of the same security principles that are best practices in other environments are still best practices here, like role-based access control, right? The idea of rather than giving sets of permissions, right, literally writing IAM policy and attaching it to users, I'm going to create groups, and those groups are going to be tied around roles, like this is the role for my systems administrators, right? This is the role for different people in my organization. Write policy for that role and attach it to the groups, and then if users leave the organization or if they change roles, you don't have to read a long policy document and try to reason about what permissions in that document need to stay for this user and which ones need to go. You can remove them from the appropriate groups and you can add them to the new groups as necessary, or if they've left the organization, you can very quickly remove them from all groups and not have to wonder if there's another piece of policy that you've got attached that's left out there hanging somewhere. IAM roles are the idea of kind of taking that to the next level. So in IAM, roles are a way for a user or a principal, right, to use the right term, in the environment can take on temporary credentials. The icon is that hard hat for a reason. Like it's the idea that you show up to work, you put on your hard hat, great, I'm a construction worker now. So IAM roles let you say, well, this user on their own has no privilege, but if they assume this role as a system administrator, now they have a set of privileges that lets them launch this CloudFormation template or launch this thing in the environment. But those are temporary credentials. By default, they last for 1 hour and then they're useless, right? And then you have to assume the role again and get a fresh set of credentials that rotates. Some of the powerful things you can do with roles, and the reason you would do that rather than groups, are roles will let you go cross account. So you can have account over here with users in it, and you can have an account over here with your production system in it, and the production system account can have IAM roles for administrative access, for maintenance, for operations, for whatever you need done. And you can say, well, these users over here can authenticate, and then they can assume this role over here to have temporary access, logged temporary access to the production environment to do what they need to do, and then they give that back up. And of course, all this shows up in your CloudTrail logs, right? So you can see that that person authenticated, assumed a role, did some operations, and then left the environment again. So the other, and we spent a lot of time on roles here, this stuff is key. But the other, I think, key thing that's important that you can do with roles that comes up in a lot of environments is you can apply roles to EC2 instances, right? It's something we call an instance profile, and it's another one of the kind of top 10 IAM best practices to do that. So if you've got a machine in your environment that needs to have access to deploy other machines or to move network interfaces around, or it needs access to S3 to grab some data that you store in S3, right? Analytics systems say, DynamoDB, et cetera. You need to give that machine permissions to talk to our API. The right way to do that is with an IAM role, because otherwise what you're going to do is you're going to create a user that symbolizes the machine, you're going to create a set of credentials, and now you have an access key and a secret key that you've got to manage. Where do you put that? Do you put that in your code? No, don't put that in your code, right? Do you put that in your config files? Better, not optimal. If you use an IAM role, a set of credentials is made available to that machine that automatically rotates once an hour. And you, as a user, it's actually, you have to do the setup of the role, but you don't have to manage credentials at all anymore. You don't even have to set up anything in the configs in your machines. The AWS SDK knows how to automatically go look for those. So if you set up the role and you apply the instance profile to the machine, and it's got the appropriate permissions, the credentialing all just works. You don't even have to touch the config file. The SDK finds the credentials, and as long as you've set up the policies, it can talk straight to S3. So you do a little bit of initial setup, and it's a whole set of sensitive things that your developers no longer have to manage. I think we're picking up somebody else's clicker. I think we were ready to move slides. The last thing I'll talk about is so much of what I'm talking about here with identity and access management right now is focused around credentials management. I think the last piece is something I've seen customers and partners stumble with in the past is managing other secrets, right? Best practice is to use IAM roles and instance profiles, but sometimes you've got a password to a database or some sort of credential to an on-premise system that you can't use an IAM role for, right? It's not part of our access control system. And you need to pass those secrets around securely, right? You need to get that database password onto your application server so it can talk back to an on-premise database. We've got 2 services now that give you an easier way to do that. One is SSM EC2 Systems Manager, has a credential management feature in it that includes KMS-backed encryption and a lot of the things you'd expect, as well as the new Secrets Manager service. So now there's two great managed service ways to move those secrets around encrypted and securely so that you're not trying to re-implement that yourself and, oh, well, I'll use this library, I'll encrypt it, I'll store it in S3. There's now a pair of services that you can take advantage of to let you move those things around securely. But my recommendation is move as few secrets around as you can. It's always better if you can offload those things because that it reduces the risk that mistakes will happen with sensitive pieces of material, right? So jumping into some preventative infrastructure controls, networking. We could talk about networking security for a long time, or at least I could. I get really passionate about this. In AWS, VPC is your core service for setting up networking security. That stands for Virtual Private Cloud. There are a lot of great VPC best practices. I'll touch on a couple ones I think are key here, a couple takeaways I want you to take with you if you go to do additional research later. One is that VPC is not Ethernet, right? So a lot of the same best practices apply, but some things you do in VPC you'll do differently. And if you want to dig further into that VPC is not Ethernet thing, there's a pair of talks I'll refer you to called Day in the Life of a Billion Packets, and Another Day, Another Billion Packets from reInvent a couple years ago, where one of our engineers that helped build VPC talks about how exactly it works and why I say that VPC is not Ethernet. With that said, the biggest thing with VPC is take advantage of the tools that are available to you and do it in a scalable, flexible way. Security groups, right? For firewalling and setting up network defense boundaries, security groups are the first and I think most important thing you can configure. They're a really flexible, really powerful firewall tool. They let you reference other security groups. You can do really cool configurations like say, this group of servers are web servers and this group of servers over here are database servers. And web servers talk to database servers on port 3306, but nothing else in the environment talks to database servers on port 3306, nothing. And when I add an additional web server, right, as long as I attach the web server security group to it, it automatically has that firewall configuration. It can automatically talk to the database server. So when we're talking about doing auto scaling, right, and machines coming into the environment and leaving the environment dynamically, if you set up the security groups, the firewall rules are applied dynamically. You don't have to go in and add another IP address, right? That was always the challenge is, well, if I had another web server, now I've got to go poke a new hole in the router ACL over here. That's the networking team. It's going to take 4 days. We better not lock it down that tight. We better just do it per tier. Right? In this environment, you can do it per machine, per TCP port, and do really, really tight isolation and segmentation, and that's a great thing in a way that's flexible. Network ACLs, right, public and private subnets, there's a lot of different configurations to look into, but if you take, they're killing me here. If you take nothing else away, start with security groups and use them as effectively as you can. That's your first stop. And then grow from there and look at ACLs, look at how you control routes out to the internet, look at proxying things, and kind of expand from there is my recommendation. System security, I'll touch on this lightly, right? But almost every solution, even as we're talking a lot about serverless and new technologies, almost every solution ends up with some EC2 instances in it, right? A lot of things, existing legacy applications, things that aren't quite ready to move to that step yet. So it's still a core part of most people's infrastructure. I think it deserves some attention. You've got to secure your EC2 instances. In most cases, you're going to do that the same way you secured your server operating systems in the past. But patch management is still important, and you still need to do it. We don't do that automatically for you. We provide you some tools that you can use, like SSM and other things, but it's your responsibility to configure and use those tools or roll out your own, whether you use some of our services or whether you decide to deploy WUS to cover your Windows instances. That's up to you, it's your choice, but one way or the other, you need to make a choice and do it. Monitoring for your servers, right? Like log shipping off of your servers is key. It's a good security best practice in any environment. We offer you lots of tools to manage that process and to do that, but whether you choose to use our tools, whether you choose to use a partner's tools, or whether you choose to roll your own, just make sure you're doing it, right? This environment gives you lots of options of different kinds of storage that you can use, right? It gives you options for lots of different analytics tools you can use to work on your logs. So it's a great place to do logging. Just the first thing you have to do, the first key step is make sure you're capturing those logs. Talking a little bit about service level protection. What I mean by that is using IAM and fine-grained policy, right? Least privilege. Least privilege comes up over and over. Least privilege on the network, least privilege in identity and access management, key best practice, right? Think about holistically the other AWS services you're using. IAM is what you use to control access to our APIs and who can do what. So when you look at services like VPC and EC2, the APIs really let you do mutable things to the infrastructure is usually the security concern there, right? Somebody with access that can change security groups, they can launch and destroy machines, et cetera. When you look at higher level services like S3 and DynamoDB, it also controls access to the data plane for those services, right? And what I mean by data plane, if that's not familiar language to you, is the idea of you use the AWS API to both configure S3 to create buckets, to put policy on buckets, as well as to access the content in buckets, right? So IAM directly controls on how you configure it, access to that data. S3 buckets, when you create them by default, are closed. The only user that has permission to a new S3 bucket is root. Root has full access, nobody else has access. You have to grant access past that. But when you grant access to S3 buckets, you're granting access to create and change them right to the S3 service, but you're also controlling access to the bucket itself and what's inside the bucket. So think about that, be considerate of that. And we'll talk about this later. I recommend monitoring changes as you're setting up CloudTrail and other services to your policies, right? Those are usually low velocity and high impact. So when you're looking at, well, where do I start monitoring my environment? Where do I start looking at these detective controls? That's one of the key areas to look, right, is policy changes. And maybe you want to do something, well, we'll talk about that when we get to the slide. I'm getting ahead of myself here. So data, I'm going to touch on this lightly, right? But this is something that almost completely, I shouldn't say that, but this is something that lies heavily in your area of security or of the shared responsibility model that you need to think about, right? Obviously, we have services where we're maintaining data as well, but in a lot of systems, this is a major focus and is pretty high on the tier. So data in transit, right? Best practices, encrypt, encrypt, encrypt. In most environments in 2018, this means using a lot of TLS in a lot of different places, right? And most things have gone to support TLS. Excellent best practice. We recommend use it everywhere you can use it, between your app servers and your database, between your load balancers and your front ends, right? If we're talking about a web app, use TLS everywhere. Both to protect the confidentiality of your data with encryption, but also to protect the integrity of data, both in and outside the environment. A neat service that can help with this, in the past, I've worked with customers who had challenges around implementing this because of certificates and CAs, right? Well, we want to do SSL, we want to do TLS everywhere. I should say TLS, not SSL, but we need to maintain certificates in the environment to do that and have that web of trust, right? There's now a private CA service that's part of AWS ACM that'll let you run a private CA where you can issue certificates. So I see that as potentially a great solution if you need to manage private certificates within your environment, within your backends, to provide TLS between the load balancers, et cetera, or want to set up kind of your own kind of PKI environment to help you manage that. Of course, you can always do your own. You always could with OpenSSL or other tools to generate those. But now there's kind of more of a managed tool in the environment that you can take advantage of for that. Data at rest, really basically the same thing. Many of our services support data at rest encryption by default using either KMS keys or keys you use. Of course, you can always choose to do client-side encryption, right, which provides you protection at a higher level, but you're always making that trade-off, right, of I can't process encrypted data. Once it's been encrypted, it's a black box. So for storage, that works great, but if you still need to process it, you've got to decrypt it again before you can work on it. So higher level provides you protection in more places, but lower level provides you more convenience, and every organization's kind of got to make a choice about where they want to be as far as how high of a level do they want to encrypt. Like, for example, do I want to encrypt on my database server at the table level, or am I okay with just full disk encryption at the bottom of the stack, so to speak? And again, we touched on this, and for the sake of time, I'm going to touch on it really briefly here, right, which is fine-grained control policy, especially when we're talking about those higher level services, right? This matters, but when we're talking about securing the cloud environment, when you're talking about services where you're granting access to data, manage those policies and be thoughtful about them. So talk a little bit about detective controls, and on these next two sections, I'm purposefully going to go a little bit on the light side because this is where Shaker's going to kind of take over and talk a little bit about some of the things they do. But with detective controls, the biggest thing is turn on CloudTrail. Turn on CloudTrail. It should be the second thing you do in any account you start after you put MFA on the root account is to turn on CloudTrail. This is your audit log for everything that happens in the AWS environment. The vast majority of the services that we have support CloudTrail, and will log events to CloudTrail. IAM definitely key service. And when you're looking at, and then kind of the second thing after that, right, is look at things you can do with those logs. Think about, and there's some good talks on this from reInvent, but think about key events in your environment that you want to manage with those logs and to alert on those logs. You can use a variety of tools to do that, right? Some built into the platform, partner solutions, et cetera. But for example, like IAM policy changes are something that you're probably real interested in. They don't tend to happen very often and they can be very impactful. So they're a good thing to flag and say, hey, great, this change has been made, but maybe I want to log a ticket and come back and do a manual review of that at some point in the future to make sure that that policy is correct and follows our internal policy. Again, we talked about this with the instances, capture logs. There's lots of log sources in AWS that can be very useful. S3 bucket logs, you want to know who's accessing S3 buckets and what content they're accessing. S3 bucket logs, right? ELBs provide access logs for what's going through the load balancer. The other thing is track state and the configurations in your environment, right? You've got config that can help you track the state of the environment over time. You've got services like config rules that can help you say, these are approved configurations, alert me if I ever deviate from these approved configurations in the environment. And that really, we're already bleeding into kind of change control, right? But looking at the log of actions that have been taken in the environment, as well as recordings of how the environment was configured, you can understand how the environment has changed and if those changes are acceptable and approved or not. Are they changes that I need to address and reverse, or are they acceptable? And responsive controls. I'm just going to touch on this very lightly, right? But everything is an API. This is an automated environment. So if you can detect something that you want to change, all you need is to sprinkle a little compute on it, and you can reverse that change, right? You can use AWS Lambda, of course, is really popular for that. If that's not available in your environment, you can use EC2 instances to do that, right? You could do that from anywhere. So any configuration you see in the environment, you can use automation to reconfigure that. You have a policy that says that nothing in our environment should have a wide open port 80 security group configuration. You can monitor for that and you can change it. This takes seconds, right? You can list every firewall configuration in the environment in seconds. You can scroll through those and look for any that match the pattern that you've decided is unacceptable in your environment. And you can make a choice, an automated choice about what to do about that, right? You can remove that rule from the group. You can flag the group for security review. Or you could just shut the machine down and say, well, you put this configuration on a machine, we turn your machine off, right? Take the kind of hard line approach. Moving quickly here, but so I think that sums up the piece I wanted to talk about. Takeaways, and I'll have a resources slide towards the back of the deck to talk about some of the AWS side things you can focus on. But there's a lot of good best practices to follow. I just touched on some of them, a smattering of them more high level and governance related, a smattering of them specific configurations I recommend. But take the time to look into those. Please take the time to read those documents and those other materials, and take good care of your environments. Thanks. Jaker.
Thanks, Nathan. That was very useful, I'm sure, for all the audience here as well. Let's see, the reason why I think what Nathan was talking about is very important is that if you look at Gartner's projections of how use of IaaS and AWS is growing, it's really nearly twice as fast as any SaaS, as the SaaS market, And so it's very important to look at security of your applications which you deploy into these IaaS environments. And if you look at the growth, the reason for the growth of IaaS, I think it's because a lot of customers are moving applications which are traditionally in the data center into these IaaS environments. And you can see again some of the analysis which shows that the significant year-over-year growth in applications moving to these environments. And so in our analysis from McAfee, we've seen that on average, there are at least 464 applications, custom applications, which are applications you've developed in your environment, which are moving to these cloud service, to these IaaS environments. And so when you move these applications to these IaaS environments, I think going back to the shared responsibility model, which Nathan touched upon, there's a lot more responsibility on your shoulders compared to the SaaS world, right? So you hear, AWS has excellent APIs and tools and mechanisms by which you can manage roles, MFA, security groups and so on, which Nathan talked about. But it's your responsibility to configure it right, to ensure that if there's any changes in your configurations, that you take action on it. And so you can see that your responsibilities go well above the layer which you have in SaaS, where SaaS, like a Salesforce or something like that, would address application level controls and below, whereas you need to address that in your AWS environment. And the other interesting stat is that a lot of application owners call in security teams much later in their deployment to IaaS than you would like. And there's nearly 62% of custom applications which are deployed without a security team's oversight. And the reason it's important is that the way third-party actors really sort of exploit some of the security misconfigurations are, as a simple but classic example is third-party bad actor may scan to look for publicly readable or writable AWS buckets, S3 buckets. Once they've identified it, they can, or they may look for whether you can modify ACLs, as well. If it is available, then you can either plant malware, and really the objective is to either extract data from these open buckets or distribute malware. And so a lot of this, the responsibility lies on your shoulders, so that you need to get ahead of this, understand how you're configured, and ensure that you have the preventative controls in place so you can secure your data. And so that's really where McAfee works very closely with AWS to help address this holistically. I'll give you a couple of examples of customer use cases and where they've seen a need for a solution like ours. There's a car rental enterprise. They had developed a custom application which was taking in credit card information and so on. And it can be any sensitive data, but in this case, it was a credit card information. For them to be PCI compliant, they need to encrypt certain fields. All of that was good. But what happened is that their internal employees, for convenience, they were adding credit card numbers and notes fields in these forms, right, which was running in an IaaS environment. And that can result in a violation of PCI because they were taking credit cards which are unencrypted in these custom fields. So being able to do DLP, so you can scan for content which is being added into your applications, looking at activities into these applications was very important for them. Another example, large agricultural company. This is classic. They had misconfigured. They didn't have visibility into the kinds of policies they had in force because there's a lot of organic adoption of AWS. So the security team did not have a central view of all of these accounts, and being able to get that level of visibility from a configuration audit, as well as understanding what kind of data was present, was very important for them. The last one example is an insurance company. They newly migrated applications to the cloud, but they required detailed logging and monitoring for incident response, and they had reasons to believe that there's some third-party actors were trying to get access to their information. And so being able to leverage CloudTrail and other very detailed and rich logs from AWS and apply analytics on top of it so that you can identify insider threats as well as external threats is very important. And those are the three categories of, if you're moving applications into AWS, you may want to think about. Is data, what kind of data is out there, what kind of activities for privileged users, and then what kind of configurations you have. Now, these three are very critical for you to ensure that you're successful in your rollout. And what we do from a McAfee perspective as well is we look at the shared responsibility model, and we really see that a lot of the top of the the top there centers around custom application, the data and the applications, right? So protecting your data and applications. And then there's also a lot of the backdoor, which is your configurations of your IaaS environment and so on, and security groups, S3 buckets, so on and so forth. So you need a holistic way in which you can secure your applications as you move to the cloud. And that's really where we augment what AWS offers natively with our products. There are two products which McAfee has which enables that. The first one is what Gartner calls CASB, which is a Cloud Access Security Broker, which is where we look at your applications which are moving to the cloud. We understand data which is being accessed to the cloud, like that car rental application I talked about, configuration audit, like that agriculture company I talked about, as well as flow analysis of what data is going in and out of your environment. And so that's something which CASB provides. There is a smaller product called CSPM in Gartner's lingo, which is really being subsumed by CASB. It is really looking at your configuration audit in essence. But that falls under the first product. And the second product is what Gartner calls CWPP, which is Cloud Workload Protection. And McAfee has a product called CWS, which is Cloud Workload Security. But this is the one which allows you to deploy agents in your hosts, understand if you want to have app whitelisting, any of the detailed HIPs, data at rest encryption if you choose something over and above what already exists in the IaaS platform, and so on and so forth. This is a pretty rich set of features which CWS offers, but the net takeaway from this slide is the combination of CWS and CASB allows you to have complete visibility, so you can then have better control of and address your shared responsibility model effectively. Let's see, how am I doing in time? Yeah. So let me walk through a couple of slides on the kind of data exfiltration vectors and how we can help address it. So we talked about it, and you all know that misconfigurations are an important vector which you need to pay attention to. There's also provisioning sprawl, where if you don't have an idea of what accounts are allowed from your environment, you may not have enough control of the kinds of controls they have in those accounts itself. So it's important. Rogue users, internal users who may be like privileged users who may be performing certain actions which you may want to take a look at. Compromised accounts, this is something which a lot of our larger customers are worried about, is if you don't have MFA, which is a bad idea, but if you want to make sure, even if you do, to make sure that your accounts are not compromised, and so you need to have an ability to look at behavioral analytics, so you understand what kind of behavior typically privileged users have, and then take action if it's something outside of the ordinary. And the last one is malware, because third-party actors are going to leverage ways in which they can persist data, traditionally in your endpoint devices, but increasingly in the cloud as well. So being able to scan your S3 or any of your persistence layers within your IaaS environment for malware, so that you can then proactively thwart any attacks is important. And the final thing is, as you move to a containerized model for your workloads, you need to look at workload-to-workload communication, understanding east-west traffic, and applying appropriate controls for that. So these are the various ways in which data can actually move out, because if you don't have appropriate visibility. So what we recommend, and what Gartner recommends as well, is use security configuration control as a way to look at provisioning sprawl and misconfigurations we talked about earlier, which is part of the CASB product. Leverage user behavioral analytics on top of the core AWS platform and guard duty, but also looking at other user behavioral analytics which will address rogue use and compromised accounts. And a lot of this, we leverage McAfee's global threat intelligence as well to better isolate and get visibility into some of these threats which may be present in your environment. And finally, for malware, we again scan data within your hosts and S3, and we can quarantine or remediate, based on doing a malware scan of any content in your environment. We also do network segmentation with VNSP. We can talk about it in more detail at a later time. But in essence, what we do is we leverage the rich set of APIs which AWS supports as a way to control your environment, to get visibility into it. We leverage a lot of the CloudTrail, CloudWatch, all of those logs, VPC flow logs, things like that, to get you that visibility. As well as APIs to remediate that as needed. For custom applications, if you're looking at the top of your value chain, which is your data and your applications, we actually have a way in which you can learn what your application is and can apply these DLP and activity controls on these applications using the CASB as well. So those are the two very high-level ways in which we achieve the value-added service we offer on top of core AWS platform solutions. And again, just to highlight, Gartner actually recommends that to use CASB as a way to protect your IaaS and PaaS environments. I have a link to the Gartner document which describes why it's important to look at a holistic security solution for IaaS using a CASB. So you can take a look at that as well. The last couple of slides, just talking about the key use cases. For custom applications which you deploy in these IaaS environments, the core 4 pillars of CASB in the context of what Gartner describes it is advanced threat protection, detecting compromised accounts, user behavioral analytics for insider, privileged users, threats, and so on. Activity monitoring and forensics, very critical for investigations and for audit trails. DLP, which is really core data leakage protection. So you want to know what kind of data resides in your IaaS environment, and to be able to do it in real time and anywhere it sits in your IaaS platform, as well as access control, where you can define controls. If I have this application in AWS, maybe I don't want to allow download of data from this application to an unmanaged device or a network which you're not comfortable with, things like that. So these are the 4 core pillars of CASB which we support for any custom application you deploy in AWS. And then once you've deployed the application, you also want to know that the infrastructure in which you deployed is secure and is controlled, and you have full visibility. And that's where we integrate with AWS APIs and logs and so on to provide that. And so there are 5 or 6 actually core use cases. The first is that when you allow use of AWS from your network, you want to make sure that the accounts which are allowed access are ones that you know of, which you are approve. And if there is an account which somebody is logging into AWS console which you're not aware of, you can do a very managed a workflow to manage these unmanaged accounts, very similar to your MDM kind of use case for devices. You can do it for accounts for IaaS. So that's a very important use case. The second one is what we've talked about a lot, and all of you are familiar with it, but very important to have security configuration monitoring, where you can identify AWS resources that are non-compliant to CIS level 1, level 2, or other policies which you can configure or extend using Lambda, as Nathan mentioned earlier, which is very useful for a lot of our customers. Third one is advanced threat protection. Start with insider threats for privileged users. Very important because these users have a lot of access to sensitive information and can do a lot of damage. So important to do that. Advanced threat protection. Activity monitoring is really around capturing all of the logs which already AWS provides, but tagging it so that you can have an application context. So not all applications are the same. You don't want to get drowned in all of these logs without an idea of which application is affected, and so you can do further investigation. So being able to tie custom applications to activity logs that you get from AWS is something which we can enable. And then visibility into confidential data is very important to do a DLP scan on S3, on any of your storage which you have in IaaS, which also integrates into, if you've already invested in other DLP solutions, we have a rich integration to your enterprise DLP as well, so you can extend it to the cloud. And the last one is, if you're using S3 buckets, for example, from third parties, you want to ensure that it's not misconfigured, because it can potentially be used for, man-in-the-middle kind of issues. So being able to look at not only what IaaS environment you control, but also third-party use of IaaS in a collaborative environment to ensure that it's secure before you use it is important. So those are the use cases. We have a number of resources which are available, which we'll make available again, and we have a booth here. We'd be glad to answer a lot of any questions you may have and demo both CWS and the CASB solution for you guys. And Nathan, do you have anything to add as well?
No, actually, well, if everybody's gotten a look at that one, I'll throw the other one. So it'll be in the deck. The decks will be available, but I figured that there'd be a set of people in the audience that want to capture a picture anyway. So those links are available to you. Those are some of the best practice documents we talked about earlier. And with that, I think we're ready to do the raffle. Oh, go for it. Well, I think you should do the honors.
All right. The winner of the drone is 9022759. 2759.
Oh, going once.
Going once. Going twice. Did anybody get it?
Oh, somebody's digging for their ticket they've misplaced.
Yeah, it's 9022759. No? I'm going to. All right, congrats. Thank you.